It's my pleasure and honor to introduce our next and final speaker for the conference, Elizabeth Marshall Thomas. Liz Thomas, as a young woman, a very young woman, went to Africa with her parents, who were anthropologists, and had a remarkable experience living for on and off, I guess, for several years with the San people, who had been continuously living in the Kalahari area for 85,000 years and had a very different relationship to the natural world than we do. Liz experienced that, and her first book as a very young woman, The Harmless People, is back behind us, and a later book whose title I've just forgotten, The Old Way, is also available. She has also written books about the lion, the cat families, the dog families, deer. Basically, she's at home with all of the species that she's had a chance to get interested in and contact with. So she is a naturalist and a natural. And she will tell you in particular about the San's relationship with lions. So, my honor to introduce Liz Thomas, better known to most of you as Elizabeth Marshall Thomas.
I'm thrilled to be here. Being a very old person, I have no knowledge of videos or things like that, just writing on paper. That's and I was these. So I'm just. This is just going to be somebody saying blah blah blah. But I was very grateful to David Rothenberg, who reminded me that I had once told him not to bother with philosophers. I'd never dare say something like that now, and it's true, but I never bothered. And so I was thrilled. Okay, when we consider our destruction of this planet, it's interesting also to consider our conduct during our first 100,000 years when we were part of various African ecosystems. We were as close to the Earth as any other mammal, and we remained so until the Neolithic, when we discovered agriculture. But the Neolithic didn't hit everywhere. In a few places, the old system seemed to work very well, and if all is going well, why change? As late as the 1950s, many of the San, formerly known as Bushmen, held a pre-Neolithic lifestyle, as was determined by archaeological studies of two functioning occupied encampments, and both showed continuous occupancy, one for 35,000 years and one for 85,000 years. And they did not have any significant change in the material culture, and there are only so many ways you can live by hunting and gathering. Starting when I was 19, it was my great honor and pleasure to visit the San in the 1950s with my parents, my brother, and several other people. We went into an area that was considered to be unexplored. It was about 120,000 square miles, known as the end of the earth. Much of it was in Namibia, some was in Botswana, and maybe southern Angola, and it included much of the Kalahari Desert. I feel that what we saw in those thousands of square miles that were pre-contact and untouched by those of us who didn't belong there, such as us, I was perhaps the situation was perhaps quite normal during the 100,000 years that we humans hunted and gathered and belonged to the ecosystem as did the other mammals. Just participating in it, not trying to control anything or own the land, just to live in it and be there. The part we visited was about 6,000 square miles and was known to the San as Nyai Nyai. and it had no surface water. The only water was in water holes, and these were hidden here and there in the enormous expanse of wilderness, where a newcomer unfamiliar with the endless wild land would not be able to find them. This helps to explain why no one from the outside had been able to go there. We were very well equipped with 2 army trucks and an army jeep, and we brought big tanks of water with us. Also 2 San men who worked for an Afrikaner farmer. The farmer had taken his land, those men's land, for his farm, but they came with us and they would know how to find water. In the unexplored interior, we met groups of pre-contact San, and I'm going to talk about what they knew. I'll also talk about how they related to other knowledgeable species. Needless to say, the word unexplored is inappropriate. The San knew every inch of it. Just the white people didn't know it, and we white people have been known to overrate ourselves. Years later, the same area was visited by a Harvard professor who was impressed by the San and said, they know almost as much as we do about their environment. I have nothing against the Harvard faculty. I went to Harvard, but his statement was wild. And he was speaking of what scientists know, not what most of us know. If one of us goes outdoors and looks around, how many life forms out there can we identify? We know it's a tree. We may even know it's an oak, but do we know what kind of an oak? We know that little dark-colored thing on the oak leaf is a bug, but do we know what kind of a bug? In the pre-contact Kalahari, little children could identify almost anything. Much of what I learned from children. I couldn't take part in hunts because women weren't supposed to have anything to do with hunting. But I would go gathering with the women, and I also hung around with the children. They really liked to show me things and teach me things, which I appreciated. One day I was with a little boy, maybe 7 or 8, and he told me, he showed me an area, and he said that a hyena had walked by there just after sunrise. I asked if he'd seen the hyena. No, but he saw, those were his tracks. He said, and sure enough, I went there, and it was at a certain distance. I saw some partial footprints in the sandy dust. I took his word for it being a hyena because I didn't doubt the sand. By that, I quickly learned not to doubt their information. And but what about the time of day? Oh yes, it was after sunrise. He showed me some infinitely tiny pinpricks crossing the hyena tracks. And he said these were the tracks of a dung beetle. I trusted him about that. But how did he know when it happened? Because the night was cold. The beetle wouldn't be moving until the sun had warmed the air. But not long after sunrise, before the sun rose, the dust would have been damp with dew, which held the tiny tracks. When the sun was up, it would dry the air, dry the dust, and the dust wouldn't hold the little tracks. I had a degree from Harvard, but I didn't know anything like that. But the little boy did. It almost seemed as if he was born with the knowledge, but of course not. He learned it between the age of 2 and 6 or 7. One of my favorite stories on this subject was told by James Sussman. He wrote a fabulous book about the sand. It's called Affluence Without Abundance. I'm not sure that the story I'm going to tell was in the book, but I saw it somewhere, but I was very impressed with it. He was walking with 2 sand men when they showed him some tracks, which they said were made by a black-backed jackal. He asked how they knew it was a black-backed jackal and not a golden jackal, because there were 2 kinds of jackals. The men just looked at him and they said, because it was. I love that story. It's so characteristic. Of course it was a black-backed jackal. Those are the tracks of a black-backed jackal, you idiot. Another time I was walking somewhere with 2 men. I was following them because they were going where I wanted to go and I didn't know how to get there. when they saw the tracks of a hyena, they decided to follow them for no special reason, so we did. The men didn't often look down at the ground, but instead they looked forward and ahead of themselves until we came to an enormous space of bare rock. It was about half the size of a football field. And I thought, well, this is the end of the tracking. They're not going to find any tracks on the rock, but instead they kept going. They walked out on the rock, and they looked around, and then they went off this way. And they went into the woods on the far side of the rock, and yes, there were the tracks of the hyena. I mean, how they did that, I have not a clue. They knew tracks, but also they knew what animals did and what the hyena would want. And the difference between where the hyena went in and the rest of the woods was, I mean, I'm not completely stupid, but it was totally mysterious to me. I don't know how they knew that. Tracking for them was like reading is to us. But they also knew what an animal was thinking, and they could predict what it would do next. I don't know how they did that. I'll never forget. The most spectacular display of sand knowledge was their arrow poison. It's hard to imagine any other discovery as remarkable as this. It's more complicated than the use of fire or inventing a computer. The poison is found in a certain kind of beetle and its parasites, one kind among literally hundreds of species of beetles. And it's not found in the adults. It's only found in the pupa. And the pupa are about 2.5 to 3 feet, somewhere in there, deep in sand under a certain kind of tree. Nowhere else. One kind of tree among hundreds of other kinds of trees. And the pupa are in casings made of little grains of sand. Nothing edible grows around these trees. There's no reason to dig there. Anyway, the adults are simple little beetles, small and dark colored. They don't do anything. I mean, they don't interact with people. There's no reason to try to understand them. They lay their eggs on the leaves of the trees, and when the larvae hatch, they crawl down the tree, under the bark, into the roots, where they creep out into the sand and stick grains of sand all over themselves. So when they're finished, when they've made their pupa casing, they look like the rest of the sand. It's hard even to notice them. You need to know what they look like before you can even find them. I would not have been able to find them had I not seen people bring them up. And if you see one, it's just a little sand ball. So the people ate certain kinds of grubs. But to find the grub, you'd have to take the sand off and see that this was a grub. It's extremely poisonous, totally fatal, but the poison must enter the bloodstream. When an antelope is hit with a poison arrow, the meat around the arrow wound is dark with poison. So you can eat it, the people would eat it with no harm. You'd have to somehow get the poison into your bloodstream. To do this, you'd have to take the pupa out of its casing, and the skin isn't harmful, so you'd have to mush up the grub, and pull the head off and squeeze out the insides, and that's the poison. How would it get into somebody's bloodstream? Okay. If it does, there's no way to stop it. There's no antidote. It destroys the hemoglobin. But this takes so long to work that you don't die for a day or two. So much can happen in any one day that how would anyone know what killed you? There is no easy way to figure out how the sand discovered arrow poison, except that they knew everything about, but I mean, knowing everything and going to that extent seems pretty remarkable to me. I mean, it seems amazing. The San were considered uneducated because they didn't go to school. They didn't have the same knowledge as does the so-called civilized world. But me, with my degree from Harvard, when compared to them with their education, I was about at the level of a 2-year-old. I could walk and talk, but that was about it. I did learn some things, though, and here comes the relationship between our kind and other creatures. I learned what to do if you meet a lion. The San had told us that you must not turn and run for any reason. You must assume an indifferent demeanor and walk away at an oblique angle. On one occasion, my brother John and I had the opportunity to put this to the test. We were walking around in the veldt, I don't remember why, and of course we didn't carry a weapon. Except for the San men when they were hunting, nobody walked around anywhere with a weapon. The women went gathering on long trips, several miles, maybe 5 miles away. Every few days they'd go, and nobody carried a weapon. And we didn't either. To our surprise, my brother and I came around a clump of bushes and found ourselves face to face with a big grown-up lion with a yellow mane, and we were just maybe 15 feet away. We were absolutely transfixed. I remember this as if it was this morning. My mind went absolutely blank. I didn't think anything, let alone what to do about this. We just stood there amazed and did nothing. So after looking at us for a little while, the lion assumed an indifferent expression and walked normally away at an oblique angle. That happened. Evidently that was what you do, and everybody seemed to know it except me and my brother. The lions and the San had much in common. Both were apex predators, both were stealth hunters, both hunted the same game in about the same way. A lion's charge was about the same length as the flight of an arrow. Both lived in groups, and because there was no surface water, a group of people and a pride of lions lived near just about every water hole. The area where we did most of our work had several water holes, and most of them had a pride of lions and a group of people associated with them. The important difference between the lions and the people was that the people used the area in the daytime and the lions used it at night. But the most interesting thing about these two groups in the 1950s was that they did not harm each other. The San hunted only for food, so they didn't hunt large carnivorous animals. Leopards sometimes hunted people, not always successfully. In one encampment, a leopard came in and grabbed a man who was sitting by his fire, but his wife grabbed her digging stick and beat the leopard, and the leopard left. She saved her husband. So they and hyenas can be driven off too, but you couldn't do that to a lion. That just wouldn't happen. I mean, you couldn't succeed. Hyenas sometimes hunted people. When people were on the move, hyenas might keep watch. People would go in single file and then would make a journey that lasted several days, so they'd camp at night. And hyenas would keep watch on these processions to see if anybody was lagging behind or struggling. I knew of 2 deaths from hyenas, but the lions did not hunt people. My brother and a colleague, Claire Ritchie, made a study of causes of death among the people we were with. They were called Quasi. That's what they named for themselves. About 100 deaths over about 100 years. They found only 1 that was caused by a lion. The victim was a paraplegic girl who pulled herself along with her hands, and she may not have seemed like a person to the lion who killed her. So just 1 death among 100 over 100 years seemed extraordinary. Lions have been hunting us since we came down from the trees, and as we all know, they still do in many places. During the 1970s in Etosha National Park, lions were blamed for keeping the freedom fighters for Namibian independence from entering Namibia from the north. Lions learned from their parents, and after a generation or two, those lions would have belonged to the same population as the lions we encountered in the 1950s. But when Etosha became a park, the hunter-gatherers who lived there were forced to leave. And lions do learn from their parents. And after a generation or two, when the only people present were the tourists in cars, a human on foot is pretty tempting. So the Etosha lions lost that aspect of their culture and became as dangerous or more dangerous than lions anywhere. I had another experience that related to the one with the lion. This was with a female hyena. This time I was alone, walking far from our encampment, when I came upon a large female hyena standing in front of her den. I could hear her puppies inside. We just looked at each other. She didn't threaten me, although I could see from her expression that she would if I showed any interest in her puppies. So after a moment, I did what the lion did. I assumed an indifferent facial expression and walked away at an oblique angle. When I was a certain distance away, I turned back to look at her, and I saw her hindquarters going into her den. Another time, one night, I was in my tent reading a book by candlelight when a male hyena put his head in through the tent flap. He probably wanted to see if I was awake and in good health. And I said, "What is it?" And he just withdrew. He withdrew very politely and left. I wasn't afraid of these animals. They seemed neither frightened nor frightening. We humans were just part of the fauna. It was different from here. For years in winter, I fed the deer, the local deer that come to my field. And day after day, they'd watch me from the woods as I put out little piles of food, one for each of them. But they were permanently afraid of humans, and if I even looked at them, they'd bolt. And that never changed. So what interested me about all this was that the San didn't think much about leopards or hyenas or have much respect for them, although now and then, but rarely, a hyena or leopard would kill someone. But lions never killed people, and even so, the people had enormous respect for them. The lions were interested in us personally in a way that leopards and hyenas weren't. Once at a much later time in another place, I was inside a fenced area working on something when there was a lioness on the other side of the fence. She was just watching me with mild interest. I mean, there was nothing else to watch. But she was sort of identifying with me. If you look at something and just keep watching it, you do kind of identify with it. When I yawned, she yawned. And I was absolutely amazed, so I yawned again, and she yawned again. This worked 3 times, but after that she knew that I was messing with her, and she didn't do it. When we were in the Kalahari, our camp was beside the San encampment. Often enough at night, a small group of lionesses might come to look at us. We'd see their eyes shining. Then some of the men would take burning branches from their nighttime fires and would shake them at the lions. But they would speak to them very respectfully. The San had great respect for elderly people, or for elders. The word old was honorary. So they would say, "Old lions, we respect you, but this is our place, and you must leave." The lions would think this over. I mean, this happened many times. The lions would think this over, they'd move around a little, then they'd slowly walk away. They hadn't been stalking us, they'd just been looking at us. How do I know that? Because lions know their eyes shine, and they can approach you in a way that you can't see their eyes shining. At a totally different time, much later, I was stalked by a lioness in another area. I was supposed to be keeping track of the animals that came to drink at a certain waterhole at night, so I was in a vehicle. The night was dark, but I noticed a lion and lioness nearby. I could see their eyes shining. They were side by side. But then I lost track of the lioness. She was moving toward the vehicle slowly. And now and then I'd notice a kind of a dark shape moving slowly, but I never saw her eyes shine. The lion was watching what she did. His eyes were shining. He was waiting for her to catch me so he could share the meal. Later in that same area, a lioness charged me. Again, I had come with a vehicle. Now, this is not with where the Bushmen were. This is in Etosha Park. Many years later. I was supposed to collect a piece of equipment we had left behind, but a lioness was lying beside it. All I knew about lions at the time was from the Kalahari lions. So I got out of the vehicle and did what the San would do. I spoke to her respectfully and said I needed that equipment beside her. And bang, she charged me at the speed of light. I jumped back into the vehicle. She was just trying to scare me, though. When I jumped in, she slowed down and went off to the side. She succeeded in scaring me. Lions communicate with people. The lion who chased me communicated in a way, and so did others elsewhere. They have territories, of course, and in Nyai, when we moved to somewhere else, the lions whose territory we entered would wonder what was going on, and they would come to see what we were and look at us. One night when we were traveling, we were very tired and didn't bother to make a camp or even much of a fire. We just put our sleeping bags on the ground and went to sleep. The lions who owned the territory did what any lions would do. They wanted to know what was going on, so during the night they came to see us. They came right up beside us and looked down at our faces, as we discovered in the morning when we found their tracks. I was glad I didn't wake up to find myself looking up the nostrils of a lion. That could have made a lot of trouble for me. On another occasion, we were camped in a new place and the local lions came to investigate. I guess they didn't like what they saw because they roared with what is known as choral roaring. It's horrifying, deafening sound that went on for what seemed like hours. A lion roars, and when he runs, some lions roar, and when they run out of breath, other lions are roaring, so it's a continuous, deafening sound. The men of our group had gone off somewhere. Just my mother and me and some of the San women were there. We were in our tent. My mom wanted to zip me into a sleeping bag to hide me from the lions. But I couldn't, death before dishonor, I couldn't do that. But then, and right in the middle of this, while the roaring was still going on, one of the San men, he'd come from a considerable distance, and he walked alone in the dark, right past the lions, to see where, because he wanted to be with his wife and children. Anyway, that's how that was back in the time I was talking about earlier, when lions didn't hurt people. Why did the lions and the San not kill each other? I believe it was because there was no surface water. Both lions and people needed to live near water holes. If the lions had troubled the people, or the people had troubled the lions, sooner or later, one group would eventually be driven away. The people were connected to relatives elsewhere and could go there to live, although too many people at an encampment can challenge the food supply. But for lions to be driven away would be tragic. They'd go to another waterhole. Those who still lived and could travel would go to another waterhole and try to take it from the resident lions, and that would result in much injury and death, and the losers would be forced to leave, to wander in the veldt alone or in pairs, looking for little watery melons or leftover rain in hollow trees. They could also get water from their dead victims, but first you have to get a victim. This wouldn't happen every day by any means. In short, it is difficult for lions to lack access to water. Better to stay at your own water hole and live in peace with those who share it. And that was essentially the lesson of the Kalahari, the lesson of 100,000 years of human experience. It's completely gone now, completely gone. I suppose it could be cultivated. It could be cultivated somewhere else with animals, but that remains for us to do. Well, thank you very much.